As House Republicans continue to display their dishonesty, dysfunction, and incompetence, I want to draw your attention to an unlikely and unusual Republican who has intrigued me. But before we unpack all that, if you haven't yet, please hit that like, subscribe, and the alert bell. Maybe check out my Patreon. I'd appreciate the support. All right, folks, so yeah, the current situation for the Republican Party is dire, which means it's hilarious for those of us on the left, okay? So the House of Representatives is still in recess, which is kind of not funny, especially since Israel is currently waging a war against Hamas. Russia's still, invading Ukraine. We're 40 days away from a government shutdown. So the House of Representatives needs to get back in order, and it's Republicans that are causing it to stay in recess, to be paralyzed, to be non-functional. And as they continue to demonstrate how much of a clown show they are, there is one Republican who has intrigued me. And I've mentioned him in previous videos, but he's becoming more and more intriguing to me. And his name is Ken Buck. He's a Republican congressman from Colorado. Now, we're going to play some clips here, okay? But before we play the clips, I just want to give you some background on Ken Buck's positions, because when you hear these clips, you might be thinking, is this guy sure he's a Republican? Is he kind of confused? He's not confused, all right? This man is a lifelong conservative, and his policy positions prove it, okay? We'll get to the clips in just a second. But he's such a conservative. He's such a Republican. Not only did he support Donald Trump in the 2020 election, he actually signed on to an amicus brief in one of the lawsuits between Texas and Pennsylvania, in which Texas tried to overturn the Electoral College results in Pennsylvania to try to steal the election for Donald Trump. He endorsed it. But then when the Supreme Court made its decision, he effectively said, okay, well, that's the end of it. And he didn't support Congress trying to overturn the results of the election because he didn't think it was Congress's place. He opposes abortion, including in instances of rape and incest, okay? He opposed COVID-19 restrictions. He believes that the Department of Education is probably unconstitutional and should be abolished. He rejects the scientific consensus on climate change. I mean, this dude is a far-right radical Republican who is also a member of the Freedom Caucus, the Trump-loving far-right Freedom Caucus. Okay, so this is who this man is. And yet, I want you to keep this in mind when we play these clips, because this is him commenting on the aftermath of Republicans trying to internally designate who will be the next nominee for the speakership: Steve Scalise, Kevin McCarthy's former number 2, or Jim Jordan. Okay, and so we're going to play, I think, 2 or 3 clips here. But he actually voted, he didn't vote for either one of them internally. He doesn't support either one of them, and I want you to hear why.
Well, I have 3 issues that I want to know about. I asked last night, will you unequivocally and publicly state that the election, the 2020 presidential election, was not stolen? He didn't answer that question very clearly, and Jim Jordan didn't answer that question very clearly. The second issue I have is what is the spending number that we're all going to agree on? It doesn't have to be my number, but I think if we're going to go and move forward with appropriations bills, we need to know what that number is. And the third question I had is, will you put Ukraine funding on the floor? I understand that he wants to see a plan from President Biden, but even if the plan doesn't meet his expectations, will he put the vote on the floor so the rest of us can vote on that issue?
Okay, so interesting stipulations, all right. They sound fairly moderate in today's political climate, which again is weird when you consider that his policy positions are not moderate. They are as far right as it gets, but particularly about the 2020 election. So I want to play another clip here.
As simple as saying the 2020 election wasn't stolen, why don't you think either one of those gentlemen can commit to that?
I think there is a large group of Trump followers in this country that would disagree with that, and there would be a political penalty for saying such a thing.
Got it.
So he wants them to come out and say that President Biden won the election freely and fairly, which of course he did. And he says that the only reason that anybody would not answer that clearly or like rise to the occasion would be because Trump would punish them, or Trump supporters would punish them, which again is true, but you don't usually hear that from far-right Republicans. I want to play one more clip here.
Well, both Jim Jordan and Steve Scalise voted to decertify the electors. I don't know that it's going to be a very big factor at all. I think the factor, George, is that we continue to perpetuate a lie about the 2020 election being stolen, that we talk about the January 6th events as a unguided tour of the Capitol, that we are pretending that the people who assaulted police officers and destroyed federal government property property are political prisoners. That hurts our ability and credibility to move forward with the American people and tell the American people that we have a serious issue with spending. We, as Republicans, can do a better job securing our border. We know how to deal with inflation. We can deal with the crime issue in our cities. That's the problem I think we have when we continue to perpetuate the myths that we're perpetuating.
Yeah, I'm confused. Like a lot of people are speculating that he may just be, trying to get get out of Congress and, find some sort of like CNN gig, correspondent gig, which is entirely possible. But again, I'm baffled, not necessarily because his views are incongruent. It's entirely possible to be a far right conservative on policy issues and still oppose various aspects of the MAGA cult, because as we've discussed on this channel, and it is simply a fact, Donald Trump is not really a conservative, not ideologically speaking, not politically speaking. He's a profoundly stupid and ignorant man. He has no political ideology. He's a malignant narcissist. It's all about him. But it's rare. It's so rare to find and I'm going to use this term loosely, a principled conservative. When I say principled, I'm not saying that their policy views are acceptable or worthwhile. They're terrible. Like Ken Buck is awful on policy, right? But principled in the sense like a relative consistency. It's entirely possible to have a consistent view on these far right policy prescriptions and also reject, wanting to overturn the election, what you believe is extra legally, like illegally. But again, just as a reminder, Ken Buck is not a Biden fan. Ken Buck is not saying these things because he loves Joe Biden. You can track the legislation. He votes with President Biden about 10% of the time, which is criminally low when you consider how painfully bipartisan President Biden tries to be. So again, I find that very interesting. And maybe, again, there's an ulterior motive. Maybe he's just saying these things because he's like, I don't want to deal with this anymore. I want a pretty sweet gig as a correspondent on MSNBC or CNN as the token conservative. Maybe. But the fact that he's got this legislative and policy history and he's still living it, and he's also decrying the even more unhinged, fascistic elements of the MAGA Republican Party while being in the MAGA Republican, not just in the Republican Party, but in the Freedom Caucus, which is basically Donald Trump's proxy in Congress. I find this fascinating. Be interested to see or hear what those of you have to say, because again, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. I think that Democrats and those of us on the left should use Ken Buck when and where appropriate. And then, of course, because he has reprehensible ideas about policy, which would, by the way, hurt the vast majority, like him rejecting climate change, the consensus on climate change, that's not just bad for progressives, that's bad for Republicans and conservatives, because they're also going to be affected in harmful ways by climate change if we don't try to address it. So use Ken Buck when and where appropriate, and then discard him because clearly he has terrible views on government. But I do find it interesting. So I'd be curious to hear or read what those of you have to say about this. What do you think is up with Ken Buck?